I am Claire, 33 years old, and I will never forget the sound of my brother laughing at my expense on his wedding day. Poor Sis, still stuck at the bottom of that tiny, no-name firm Mason, sneered into the microphone, parading his arrogance before hundreds of high-profile guests. He smugly promised to float me alone when he made vice president on Monday. Minutes later, the room went dead silent as his own chief executive officer rushed past him, bowed respectfully to me, and revealed the absolute truth. I did not just work at a firm. I owned his entire company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to use your success to crush the arrogance of toxic family members. His destruction actually started the day before the wedding. I was standing in the grand lobby of the Plaza Hotel, quietly checking into the luxury suite I had booked and paid for months in advance. The marble floors echoed with the bustling of affluent guests, but all I could hear was the demanding, sharp voice of my mother, Catherine. She marched up to me with my father, Thomas, trailing closely behind her like an obedient shadow. Mason stood next to them, sporting a smug grin that instantly made my blood boil. "Hand over the room key, Claire," my mother demanded, not even bothering with a simple greeting. "Kendra and her family need the luxury suite, now. Her relatives flew in from Atlanta and they are people of real status. We cannot have them crammed into standard rooms like commoners." Kendra, my 31-year-old sister-in-law, was a successful public relations director from a prominent African-American family. She had always made it abundantly clear that she considered my family a mere stepping stone for her own aggressive social climbing. And my parents worshipped the ground she walked on. They desperately wanted to impress her elite family, even if it meant stepping on my neck to do it. I looked at my mother and stated calmly that I had paid for the suite with my own hard-earned money. My father immediately stepped forward, his face flushed with sudden irritation. "Do not be selfish, Claire. You only work at a tiny, no-name boutique firm. Mason is about to be promoted to vice president at Technova on Monday. Do not embarrass Kendra and her family like you embarrassed us when you dropped out of the corporate track 5 years ago." 5 years ago, I had left a highly toxic corporate job to build my own private equity firm from scratch. My parents had called me a complete failure, a dropout, and a permanent disappointment. They had completely cut off their emotional support, funneling all their praise and financial resources into Mason. To them, Mason was the flawless golden child destined for absolute greatness, while I was the embarrassing outcast they constantly had to hide from their elite social circle. Mason crossed his arms, looking down at me with absolute disdain and a mocking chuckle. "Just give up the key, Claire. You are used to living in cramped, cheap spaces anyway. Do not ruin my wedding weekend just because you are terribly jealous of my success. If you behave yourself today, I might even put in a good word for you at Technova so you can finally get a real job." I did not cry. I did not argue or raise my voice. Years of emotional abuse had taught me that explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me was a complete waste of breath. I simply reached into my designer handbag, pulled out the gold-plated room key, and placed it gently onto the concierge desk. "Take it," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. "Have a wonderful weekend, Mason." My mother snatched the key, instantly muttering under her breath about how I always had to make things difficult before finally doing the right thing. They turned and walked away toward the VIP elevators, completely oblivious to the fact that they had just sealed their own spectacular downfall. I calmly requested a standard room near the service elevators. The receptionist looked highly apologetic, but I offered her a polite, reassuring smile. A small room was all I needed for what was about to happen next. Once I was securely behind the closed doors of my cramped quarters, I dropped my bags and opened my laptop. I did not shed a single tear over their blatant cruelty. Instead, I logged into a highly encrypted offshore server and reviewed a massive legal document. I am the founder and chairman of Apex Holdings, a private equity firm that quietly manages billions in assets. While my family spent the last 5 years mocking my supposed failure, I had been busy buying up corporate empires. I pulled up the digital contract on my screen. It was a $150 million acquisition agreement. The target company was Technova. With a few decisive keystrokes, I applied my digital signature and authorized the massive wire transfer. Apex Holdings had just officially purchased Technova outright. I closed the secure banking portal just as my phone buzzed with an incoming text from Mason. The cruel message read, "Thanks for the luxury room, you loser. Try not to embarrass us at the rehearsal dinner tonight." I simply chuckled to myself as an email notification popped up on my screen, completely overriding his pathetic insult. It was a direct, encrypted message from Mr. Harrison, the chief executive officer of Technova. The subject line read, "Acquisition complete." The email confirmed that the board of directors was fully prepared for my complete restructuring plan on Monday morning. My brother thought he was on the verge of becoming a powerful vice president. He had absolutely no idea he was about to become permanently unemployed. My phone vibrated violently against the cheap veneer desk of my cramped room, pulling my attention away from the freshly signed corporate acquisition documents. The screen lit up with a continuous barrage of demanding texts from Mason. "Go pick up Kendra from the salon right now. Make sure you fetch the vintage champagne for the bridal suite. Do not be late carrying the gift bags to the rehearsal dinner tonight." He was treating me like an unpaid intern, fully expecting me to drop everything to serve his bride-to-be. Kendra had always demanded a royal entourage, and my family eagerly offered me up as the sacrificial servant to keep her happy. I stared at his messages, a cold smile touching my lips. I typed a single word in response. Busy. I tossed the phone onto the bed and returned my focus to the encrypted financial dossiers Mr. Harrison had just sent over. A few hours later, I arrived at the rehearsal dinner. My parents had chosen Le Petit Chateau, one of the most exclusive and overpriced French restaurants in the entire city. The private dining room was overflowing with Kendra's affluent relatives. They were all dressed in flashy designer labels, projecting an image of untouchable wealth and high society. Mason was holding court at the head of the long mahogany table, playing the role of the successful corporate titan. He had his arm wrapped tightly around Kendra, who was draped in heavy silk and sparkling jewelry. When I walked in wearing a simple, unbranded black dress, my mother audibly gasped in sheer horror. She hurried over, grabbing my arm and pulling me into a quiet corner. "Could you not have found something decent to wear?" Catherine hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward Kendra's parents. "You look like a waitress. You are completely embarrassing us." I simply stepped out of her tight grip and took a seat at the very far end of the table, as far away from the golden couple as possible. The evening quickly devolved into a grotesque display of financial arrogance. Mason and Kendra wanted to prove they belonged among the absolute elite. They commanded the waitstaff with obnoxious authority, ordering plates of imported caviar, massive seafood towers, and prime steaks topped with freshly shaved white truffles. Mason loudly called for 3 bottles of rare vintage Bordeaux wine, making sure everyone at the table knew they cost an absolute fortune. I watched him swirl his expensive wine, bragging endlessly to Kendra's uncles about the brilliant strategy pitch he was delivering on Monday that would guarantee him an executive role at Technova. Kendra leaned across the table, her eyes locking onto my plain dress with a look of pure condescension. "It is such a shame your little boutique firm is not doing well, Claire," she announced loudly, ensuring the entire room could hear. "But do not worry. Mason is incredibly generous. Once his promotion is official, maybe he can hire you as his personal assistant so you can finally afford some nice clothes." Laughter erupted around the table. My father, Thomas, chuckled along, clearly thrilled to see Mason elevated at my expense. I took a slow sip of sparkling water and remained entirely silent. My absolute lack of reaction seemed to irritate them even more. 2 hours later, the exorbitant feast finally came to an end. The head waiter approached the head of the table, placing a thick leather folder directly in front of my father. Thomas opened it, glanced at the staggering total, and without a second of hesitation, he snapped the folder shut and slid it all the way down the long table. It stopped directly in front of my plate. "Consider this your wedding gift to your brother," my father commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "You have not contributed a single dime to this wedding, Claire. It is time you paid your fair share to this family." I opened the leather folder. The bill was exactly $6,500. Mason laughed, taking a large gulp of his vintage wine. "Thanks, sis. My money is completely tied up in closing the deal on our new suburban mansion. Since you are single and living in a tiny apartment, floating this bill is the absolute least you can do to repay Mom and Dad for raising you." A normal person might have cried or screamed at the absolute audacity of being extorted for a $6,500 dinner they barely touched. But I was not a normal person, and I was no longer the weak, dependent girl they thought I was. I did not argue. I did not complain. I reached into my handbag and pulled out a solid titanium Centurion card. It was completely black, devoid of any flashy logos, a card issued only by invitation to the ultra-wealthy. I placed it in the folder and handed it back to the waiter. My mother rolled her eyes, scoffing under her breath. "She is probably putting it on a high-interest credit card she will be paying off for the next 10 years, she whispered to my father. Pathetic. What my parents did not know was that the credit cards they had been maxing out for the last 5 years to fund Mason's luxurious lifestyle were actually paid off by me. I had set up an anonymous trust that quietly settled their massive debts every single month to keep them from declaring bankruptcy. I had subsidized the very arrogance they were currently throwing in my face, shielding them from the financial ruin their golden child was causing. As the waiter returned my card and I signed the receipt, my phone vibrated in my lap. It was an automated corporate alert from the Technova Human Resources server, a system I now fully owned and controlled. The notification was brief and highly satisfying. It stated that Mason Williams had officially submitted his portfolio and strategy pitch for the vice president promotion. I stared at the screen, a genuine smile finally gracing my lips. My brother had just handed his entire professional future over to the corporate system. He was eagerly waiting for upper management to approve his ascent to power. What he failed to realize was that starting at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, I was upper management. I slipped my phone back into my purse, stood up from the table, and wished the happy couple a beautiful wedding. The trap was perfectly set. I left the lavish French restaurant behind, stepping out into the cool night air. The heavy dinner had been an exhausting display of false wealth, but my mind was entirely focused on the digital trap I had just armed. I took a standard cab back to the Plaza Hotel, avoiding the expensive black car services my parents were so fond of flaunting. The ride gave me a moment to review the incoming alerts from my executive team at Apex Holdings. Everything was moving exactly according to my timeline. The city lights blurred past the window, reflecting the cold, calculated precision of my next move. When I finally reached my floor and walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway toward my cramped room near the service elevators, I noticed my door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stood frozen in the doorway. Mason was standing right by my small desk, casually slipping a sleek silver flash drive into his tuxedo pocket. He did not even have the decency to look ashamed when he saw me. He just offered that same arrogant, infuriating smirk. "What are you doing in my room?" I asked, keeping my voice remarkably level. Mason shrugged, adjusting his expensive cufflinks with a sickening sense of entitlement. Just taking a little inspiration for my big presentation on Monday, he replied, stepping toward the door. I saw you working on your laptop earlier, before you moved down to this closet. That artificial intelligence framework you were outlining is actually pretty decent. It is way too complex for whatever tiny failing boutique firm you work for, so I did you a favor and downloaded a copy. I am going to pitch it to Chief Executive Officer Harrison to guarantee my vice president spot. He was blatantly admitting to corporate espionage and intellectual property theft. I stared at him, calculating the sheer magnitude of his stupidity. You broke into my room and stole my proprietary strategy, I stated, making sure to enunciate every single word. Before Mason could respond, the elevator chimed and my parents stepped out into the hallway. They had just returned from the rehearsal dinner, still glowing from the extravagant meal I had just paid for. Catherine took one look at the tension between us and immediately stepped in front of Mason, shielding him like a protective barricade. "What is going on here?" she demanded, glaring at me. "Are you causing trouble again, Claire?" "Your golden child just broke into my room and stole my work," I replied smoothly. "He downloaded my corporate strategy to pass off as his own on Monday. He is attempting to build his entire future on my intellectual property." My father rolled his eyes, letting out a loud sigh of deep annoyance, acting as if my basic right to privacy was a massive inconvenience to his evening. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Claire. Mason is about to secure a massive executive promotion at a major tech company. Your little startup projects are completely useless anyway. You should be incredibly proud to sacrifice a tiny bit of your work to help your brother succeed. This is exactly why you have failed in your career. You do not understand the value of family loyalty or basic generosity." My mother aggressively pointed a finger at my chest. "After you embarrassed us in front of Kendra and her family by dressing like a cheap waitress, letting Mason use your little project is the absolute least you can do to apologize. If you make a scene about this, I will personally see to it that you are completely banned from the wedding tomorrow." I looked at the three of them standing there in the dreary hallway. They were so thoroughly convinced of their own superiority. They truly believed they had successfully bullied me into submission. Mason tapped the flash drive in his pocket, laughing under his breath. "Do not worry, sis. When this pitch lands me a 6-figure bonus next week, I will buy you a nice gift card so you can upgrade your tragic wardrobe." I did not reach for the flash drive. I did not yell, and I did not threaten to call the police. I simply stepped aside, leaving the path to the elevators completely clear. "Keep it," I said, my voice dripping with cold compliance. "I genuinely hope it brings you exactly what you deserve." Mason laughed loudly, high-fiving our father as they walked down the hall. Catherine shot me one last look of absolute disgust before following them. They disappeared into the VIP elevator, leaving me entirely alone. I walked into my room and quietly locked the door behind me. I opened my laptop to assess exactly what he had taken. The fool had copied my master strategy for Apex Holdings' integration of Technova. It was a brilliant, aggressive artificial intelligence framework designed to identify and eliminate redundant middle management. It was, ironically, designed to fire people exactly like Mason. But what Mason did not know, and what his limited intellect could never comprehend, was the fatal flaw in his stolen prize. My framework contained a highly advanced algorithm dependency. It required a proprietary master encryption key to run, a key only I possessed. If anyone attempted to upload that raw data file into the Technova corporate mainframe without my direct digital authorization, the system would immediately recognize it as a hostile cybersecurity threat. It would instantly trigger a massive internal lockdown, freeze the user out of the entire network, flag the upload as federal intellectual property theft, and alert the highest levels of corporate security. It was a digital poisoned apple, and Mason was about to take a massive bite right in front of his board of directors. I opened my encrypted email portal and drafted a direct message to the head of Technova Corporate Security, a man who now answered exclusively to me. The message was simple and absolute. Monitor all external uploads from the credentials of Mason Williams, starting Monday morning. If he attempts to integrate external artificial intelligence files, do not block the upload. Let the system capture the source data, lock his terminal, and prepare a full forensic report for my desk. I hit send and leaned back in my chair. The jaws were fully open, waiting for the prey to step inside. Mason thought he was stealing a golden ticket to the executive suite, completely unaware that he had just stolen the very weapon I would use to publicly execute his entire career. The next morning arrived with a flurry of chaotic activity. It was the day of Kendra's elite bridal shower brunch, an event designed exclusively to showcase her family's immense wealth and social standing. I received a sharp text from my mother at 6 in the morning, ordering me to report to the penthouse suite immediately to assist the bridal party. I was expected to play the role of the obedient, invisible servant. I dressed in a simple, elegant outfit, ensuring no flashy labels were visible. I grabbed my purse and headed toward the penthouse, fully prepared to endure hours of relentless humiliation. The air in the hotel corridors felt heavy with anticipation. Every step I took toward that penthouse was a step closer to the ultimate reckoning. I knew the insults were coming. I knew they would try to break my spirit one final time before the ceremony. But they were entirely unaware that they were mocking the executioner who already held the axe over their financial futures. Standing outside the heavy oak doors of the penthouse suite, the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking crystal glasses echoed in the hallway. Before I pushed the doors open to face the bridal shower, I paused and pulled out my phone. A secure message from David, my senior wealth manager at Apex Holdings, lit up the screen. "Good morning, Claire. The $6,500 charge from the restaurant cleared seamlessly on your black card. Shall I proceed with the standard monthly transfer to cover your parents' credit card minimums?" I stared at the message, a wave of cold realization washing over me. For 5 solid years, I had been the invisible shield standing between my parents and total financial ruin. When I left the corporate world to start my own firm, my parents publicly disowned my career choices. But behind closed doors, their own finances were crumbling. They had remortgaged their home and drained their retirement accounts to fund Mason and his luxurious lifestyle. They paid for his designer suits, his luxury car lease, and the massive down payment on his upscale condo, all to maintain the illusion that their golden boy was a self-made success. Meanwhile, they were drowning in high-interest debt. Through a blind trust, I had been quietly paying off those debts every single month. They thought it was a miracle grace period from the bank. They had no idea their despised daughter was the only reason they were not living on the streets. I typed a swift, decisive reply to David. "Cancel all future transfers to Thomas and Catherine Williams. Dissolve the blind trust immediately. Let them face the absolute reality of their choices." Just as I hit send, a second notification popped up from the Technova executive portal. It was a formal system alert. Mason Williams has officially finalized his portfolio submission for the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives position. Final board approval required. As the sole owner of Technova, I now held the ultimate power to approve or deny his entire future. I locked my phone and slid it into my purse. The trap was fully constructed. Now it was time to watch them step inside. I pushed open the double doors to the penthouse suite. The room was a chaotic explosion of pink floral arrangements, silver balloons, and catered gourmet pastries. Kendra sat in the center of the plush velvet sofa, wearing a custom white silk robe surrounded by her high society bridesmaids. My mother was hovering nearby, desperately trying to laugh at jokes she did not understand, just to fit in with Kendra and her wealthy relatives. The moment I stepped into the room, the vibrant chatter came to an abrupt halt. Kendra looked me up and down, her expression souring, as if I had just tracked mud onto a pristine white carpet. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Kendra announced loudly, making sure every woman in the room was listening. "I thought you would be too embarrassed to show your face after that pathetic display at dinner last night. But since you are here, do not just stand there taking up space. Go to the kitchen and fetch us some fresh mimosas. And make sure you pour the good champagne, not the cheap stuff you are probably used to drinking." My mother shot me a panicked, threatening glare, silently commanding me to obey. I did not move. I maintained unbroken eye contact with Kendra, my posture perfectly straight and completely relaxed. "Are you deaf?" Claire Kendra snapped her perfectly manicured nails, tapping impatiently against her crystal glass. "I need a refill. And while you are at it, grab a towel and wipe up that spilled orange juice near the balcony doors. We cannot have the photographer slipping." She was intentionally treating me like the hired help, using my presence to elevate her own status in front of her elite friends. One of her bridesmaids, a woman dripping in diamonds, leaned over and whispered loudly enough for the whole room to hear. "Is this the sister who works at that failing little startup?" Kendra let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Yes, the family freeloader. Mason is the only one with actual corporate talent. He is practically carrying the entire family reputation on his back." I slowly walked toward the center of the room. The air grew incredibly tense. I did not head toward the kitchen. I did not reach for a towel. I stopped directly in front of Kendra, towering over her seated position. "I am not your maid, Kendra," I stated, my voice calm, smooth, and dangerously quiet. "If you want a drink, you can pour it yourself." The entire penthouse gasped in collective shock. My mother lunged forward, grabbing my arm with a crushing grip. "Claire, apologize right now," Catherine hissed, her face pale with absolute terror. "How dare you speak to your future sister-in-law that way? Do you want to ruin this entire weekend?" I gently but firmly pried my mother and her tightening fingers off my arm. "I am not ruining anything, Mother. I am simply establishing a boundary. I will not be spoken to like a servant by a woman who is marrying into a financial house of cards." Kendra stood up rapidly, her face flushed with furious indignation. "A house of cards? How dare you? Mason is about to be a vice president. He makes more in a month than your failing little business makes in a year. You are just a bitter, jealous failure who cannot stand to see us thrive." I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a calculated, lethal expression. "Is that what Mason told you?" I asked, my tone dripping with genuine amusement. "Did he tell you about his massive savings account? Did he tell you how he funded the down payment on that beautiful new suburban mansion you two are buying? Because if you truly believe Mason is a self-made millionaire, you are in for a devastating surprise on Monday morning. Wealth is not about ordering expensive wine and charging it to someone else. Real wealth is silent, and your groom is screaming at the top of his lungs." Kendra dropped her jaw. For a split second, a flicker of genuine doubt crossed her eyes before absolute rage consumed her. "Get out!" she screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "You are socially unfit to be here. You are completely banned from the VIP photos and the bridal party. I do not want to see your face until the ceremony, and even then you better sit in the back where you belong." I gave her a crisp, polite nod. With pleasure. I turned on my heel and walked out of the penthouse, the heavy doors clicking shut behind me. As I walked down the hall, my phone buzzed again. Mason had just sent an email from his corporate account to several major Wall Street investment funds, attempting to spread defamatory lies about my firm. It was his desperate retaliation. He was trying to destroy me. I laughed out loud in the empty hallway, because those exact Wall Street funds were my closest business partners. The echo of my laughter faded into the quiet luxury of the penthouse hallway. Mason and his desperate attempt to sabotage my firm via email was laughable, but it also signaled that he was actively escalating his attacks. I needed to secure my secondary communication channels before he tried anything else. I took the elevator down to the lower levels, navigating the labyrinth of service corridors until I reached my cramped, standard room. As I approached my door, the handle clicked loudly. The door swung open, and Mason stepped out into the hallway, hurriedly stuffing a sleek black solid-state drive into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He froze for a fraction of a second when he saw me, but the surprise quickly melted into that familiar, arrogant smirk. He had bypassed the cheap hotel lock. My mind raced instantly, cataloging what was stored on that specific drive. It was not just general files. It contained the highly confidential artificial intelligence strategy framework I had been drafting exclusively for the Technova restructuring. It was the exact blueprint I planned to use to overhaul the company after the acquisition was announced. Mason chuckled, casually adjusting his lapels, as if he had not just committed a federal crime. "Well, look who it is," he sneered. "I was just checking on you, sis, making sure you were not crying in your room after Kendra put you in your place upstairs." I kept my expression entirely neutral, my eyes locked on the faint bulge in his jacket pocket. "You broke into my room," I stated flatly, "and you stole my encrypted drive." Mason threw his head back and let out a loud, patronizing laugh. "Stole is such an ugly word, Claire. I am simply borrowing some inspiration. I took a look at the files on your laptop while you were up there making a fool of yourself at the bridal shower. That artificial intelligence framework you designed is actually brilliant. It is completely wasted on a failing little boutique firm like yours. You do not even have the capital to implement a system like this. But Technova does. I am going to pitch this exact framework to Chief Executive Officer Harrison as my own original concept on Monday. This is the final piece I need to guarantee my promotion to Vice President. You should be thanking me. I am finally putting your useless hobbies to good use in the real corporate world." The sheer audacity of his confession was staggering. He was openly admitting to stealing my intellectual property to secure a promotion at the very company I now owned. "Give it back, Mason," I demanded, stepping forward to block his path to the elevators. "I am not going to ask you twice." Before he could respond, the heavy doors of the stairwell swung open. My parents, Thomas and Catherine, emerged into the hallway. They had clearly been looking for Mason to ensure he was ready for the pre-wedding photographs. My mother took one look at my defensive stance and instantly rushed forward, inserting herself between me and her precious golden child. "What on earth is your problem now, Claire?" she snapped, her voice echoing sharply against the narrow walls. "He just broke into my hotel room and stole my proprietary corporate data," I explained, calmly refusing to break eye contact with Mason. "He is planning to pass off my work as his own to his executive board." My father scoffed loudly, waving his hand in the air, as if swatting away a minor annoyance. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Claire, stop being so dramatic. We all know your little startup does not need this kind of advanced technology. You are barely keeping your head above water as it is." Mason has a real career. He is dealing with millions of dollars and high-stakes corporate negotiations. If your little project can help him secure his vice president title, then you should be handing it over willingly. My mother nodded vigorously in agreement, her eyes narrowing at me with pure contempt. "Exactly. As his sister, you should be proud to sacrifice your little project for his success. Do you have any idea how much pressure Mason is under right now? He is trying to build a real future for his new family. He is buying a massive house in the suburbs. He needs this promotion. And he deserves it, far more than you deserve to play pretend chief executive officer at your tiny office. The fact that you are trying to hoard a few digital files instead of helping your own flesh and blood shows exactly how selfish and bitter you have become. It is no wonder you have no real friends and no husband. I stood there, in the dim light of the service hallway, absorbing the full weight of their words. They were not just turning a blind eye to his theft, they were actively justifying it. They were actively participating in the attempted destruction of my professional life solely to prop up the illusion of his. A profound, icy calm washed over me. I realized in that exact moment that there was absolutely nothing left to save here. There was no misunderstanding to clear up. There was no hidden affection waiting to be unearthed. They were parasites, and they had chosen their host. I looked at my father, then my mother, and finally at Mason, who was grinning triumphantly behind them. "You are absolutely right," I said, my voice dropping to a soft, chilling whisper. "Mason has a real career, and he deserves everything that is coming to him on Monday." I stepped aside, leaving the path to the elevators completely clear. "Keep the drive, Mason. Pitch it to Mr. Harrison. Make sure you tell the entire executive board that every single line of that framework was your own original idea. Own it completely." Mason patted his jacket pocket confidently. "Do not worry, I will. And maybe, when I get my signing bonus, I will throw a few $1,000s your way so you can keep the lights on at your sad little office. Come on, Mom, Dad. Let us go take those VIP photos. We do not want to keep Kendra waiting." The three of them walked past me, a united front of arrogance and delusion. I watched them disappear around the corner, listening to their fading laughter. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully bullied the family failure into submission yet again. I swiped my keycard and entered my room. I immediately pulled up my secure laptop and checked the access logs. Mason had taken exactly what I wanted him to take. The artificial intelligence framework on that drive was not just a strategy blueprint. It was laced with a proprietary digital signature that could only be verified by the Apex Holdings master server. The moment he tried to present that specific data architecture to the Technova systems, it would flag a massive, undeniable intellectual property breach directly to the highest level of corporate security. He was not walking into a promotion. He was walking into a federal trap, and our parents had just cheered him on as he locked the cage from the inside. The wedding was tomorrow, but his funeral was already scheduled for Monday. I sat in the quiet solitude of my standard hotel room, watching the digital access logs on my secure screen. Mason thought he had just walked away with a masterpiece of corporate strategy. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted me and secured his golden ticket to the executive suite. He had absolutely no idea he was holding a live digital grenade. The artificial intelligence framework he stole from my hard drive was not a simple presentation file or a standard slide deck. It was a highly sophisticated active system architecture designed specifically for Apex Holdings to dismantle Technova from the inside out. But more importantly, it contained a complex algorithm dependency that was completely invisible to an untrained eye. The entire framework was tethered to a proprietary master encryption key that I kept isolated on a separate offline server. If Mason attempted to implement that raw code into the Technova corporate mainframe on Monday without my encrypted authorization, the system would not just reject the file, it would initiate a catastrophic database collapse. The internal security protocols of the company would instantly perceive the foreign code as a hostile malware injection. It was a failsafe I had built to protect my own corporate assets from industrial espionage. The moment he plugged that drive in and hit upload, it would lock down the entire executive network, freeze all corporate communications, and trigger an immediate federal investigation into whoever uploaded the hostile file. Mason was not stealing a promotion. He was stealing a one-way ticket to federal prison. Later that evening, the hotel hosted a lavish welcome reception in the Grand Lounge for all the out-of-town wedding guests. I had absolutely no desire to attend the gathering, but I needed a strong black coffee from the lobby cafe to fuel my late-night acquisition paperwork. As I walked past the open double doors of the velvet-lined lounge, I could hear Mason long before I saw him. He was holding court at a massive circular booth in the center of the room. He was surrounded by his rowdy groomsmen, several of Kendra's wealthy uncles, and my blindly adoring father. The heavy mahogany table was littered with empty crystal tumblers and expensive bourbon bottles. Mason was red-faced, visibly intoxicated by both the premium alcohol and his own heavily inflated ego. I paused behind a large marble pillar in the lobby, completely hidden from their view, and listened to the architect of my supposed downfall dig his own grave. "Let me tell you, gentlemen," Mason boasted loudly, slamming his empty glass onto the table to command their attention. "Monday morning is going to change everything for my career. I have been developing this brilliant million-dollar pitch for months behind closed doors. It is an advanced artificial intelligence restructuring plan that is going to completely revolutionize how Technova operates. The board of directors is going to lose their minds when they see the level of complex coding I have designed. Chief Executive Officer Harrison is practically going to hand me the vice president title on a silver platter before lunch." One of Kendra's uncles, a wealthy real estate developer from Atlanta who always looked down on my parents, leaned forward with a look of genuine respect. "A vice president title at a major tech firm at your age is incredible, Mason. Kendra told us you are expecting a massive stock bonus with this promotion as well. She said this new pitch of yours is going to secure your financial future for decades." Mason let out a booming, arrogant laugh that echoed across the luxurious lounge. "Oh, the stock bonus is absolutely guaranteed. We are talking 7 figures, easily. I already promised Kendra we are upgrading our honeymoon to a full month in the Maldives, and that massive suburban mansion we are closing on next week is just the beginning. I am practically carrying the entire Williams family legacy on my back right now. It is a massive amount of pressure, especially with my sister being such a spectacular failure in the business world. But someone has to be the successful breadwinner." One of his groomsmen, a mid-level manager at another tech firm, chimed in. "What kind of artificial intelligence architecture are you using for the pitch, Mason? I heard Technova uses a highly restricted legacy system. Integrating modern algorithms into that old framework must have been a massive headache for you to code." I leaned against the cold marble pillar, a dark smirk forming on my lips. I waited to hear how the corporate genius would explain the complex code he did not write and could not possibly comprehend. Mason waved his hand dismissively, completely brushing off the technical question. "Oh, it is highly classified proprietary stuff, man. I cannot get into the weeds of the coding without violating my non-disclosure agreements. Just know that the logic loops I built are completely bulletproof. It is going to streamline their entire middle management tier and automate their financial forecasting. It is genius-level work." The groomsmen erupted in cheers, aggressively patting Mason on the back and raising their fresh glasses of bourbon in a chaotic toast to his impending wealth. They were completely blinded by his aggressive confidence. They saw a young, ruthless corporate shark about to conquer the technology industry. I saw a dead man walking. He was eagerly bragging about spending a 7-figure bonus from a company he did not know I owned, using a stolen presentation that would guarantee his immediate termination and potential prosecution. I stepped out from behind the marble pillar and walked directly past the open doors of the lounge. My mother, Catherine, was standing near the entrance, chatting excitedly with Kendra's mother about the floral arrangements for the ceremony. When Catherine saw me walking by, carrying a simple paper coffee cup, her bright smile instantly vanished into a scowl. She quickly stepped right in front of the doors, physically blocking my path, as if my mere presence would somehow contaminate the luxurious atmosphere they were enjoying inside. "Do not even think about going in there, Claire," my mother whispered fiercely, her eyes darting nervously toward the wealthy relatives to ensure they were not watching us. Mason is entertaining highly important guests tonight. He is networking with Kendra's uncles and securing his position in their family. You will only embarrass him looking like you just crawled out of a cheap motel room. Just take your coffee and go back to the basement before you ruin his momentum. We do not need you reminding everyone of your failed little startup while Mason is celebrating his massive success. I looked down at my mother, absorbing the sheer venom and absolute delusion in her voice. She was so desperate to protect the grand illusion of her successful son that she was willing to discard me like absolute trash without a second thought. I did not feel angry anymore. I only felt a cold, surgical detachment. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee and offered her a chilling, perfectly polite smile. "Do not worry, Mother," I replied softly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "I have absolutely no intention of interrupting his momentum. I want him to go exactly where he is heading." I turned and walked away, the sound of Mason's boisterous, drunken laughter fading into the background behind me. I returned to my cramped room and opened my laptop one last time before going to sleep. I reviewed the final acquisition documents for Technova, confirming every signature and digital seal. The trap was fully primed. The poisoned apple was resting securely in my brother's pocket. All I had to do now was endure the wedding tomorrow and watch him take the fatal bite. The sun rose over the New York skyline, casting a harsh and bright light through the small, smudged window of my standard hotel room. It was Saturday, the day of the wedding. I closed my laptop, the screen reflecting my calm and fully rested face. Mason had the flash drive in his possession. The Technova acquisition was legally binding and fully executed. Now I just had to play my part in their grand theatrical production until the curtain finally fell. My phone buzzed aggressively at exactly 7 in the morning. It was a massive group text from Kendra's maid of honor demanding that all female family members report to the private rooftop conservatory of the hotel for the official bridal brunch and gift exchange. I dressed in a tailored, minimalist, slate gray pantsuit. I wore no visible designer labels and no flashy jewelry. I walked down the long corridor and took the elevator up to the conservatory, a stunning, glass-enclosed room filled with exotic white orchids, hanging vines, and brilliant morning sunlight. Kendra's family was already gathered when I arrived. Her aunts, sisters, and cousins, all highly successful women from a prominent African-American family in Atlanta, were dressed in vibrant, high-fashion morning wear. They exuded a natural, intimidating confidence. Kendra sat at the head of a long lace-covered dining table, wearing a custom white silk dress and a delicate pearl headband. She looked like absolute royalty holding court. My mother, Catherine, was seated near her, practically vibrating with a desperate, pathetic need to be accepted by these wealthy women. She was laughing too loudly at their jokes and vigorously nodding at every single comment Kendra made. As soon as I entered the glass room, Kendra's eyes locked onto me. She did not offer a polite morning greeting or a welcoming smile. Instead, she immediately snapped her perfectly manicured fingers and pointed to a towering stack of heavy, oversized gift boxes stacked haphazardly near the entrance. "Claire, you are finally here," Kendra announced, her voice easily slicing through the soft classical music playing in the background. "Be useful and carry those massive gifts over to the display table in the corner. The hotel staff is moving far too slow this morning, and I want them perfectly arranged by size before the official photographer gets here in 10 minutes. My mother shot me a severe, threatening glare across the room, her eyes silently commanding me to obey without a single word of protest. I did not argue. I walked over to the stack and began moving the heavy boxes one by one. I was the chairman and sole owner of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm, actively acting as a physical laborer for a woman who was funding her extravagant wedding lifestyle with the very credit cards I used to pay off. I carried the velvet boxes, the heavy crystal vases, and the oversized luxury kitchen appliances across the marble floor, stacking them exactly as she demanded. The bridesmaids watched me work, whispering among themselves and sipping their chilled drinks. Once I placed the final heavy box on the display table, I wiped a small bead of sweat from my forehead. Before I could even catch my breath, Kendra held out her empty crystal flute in my direction. "Refill this," she ordered, completely ignoring the fact that several uniformed waiters were standing just a few feet away. "The mimosa bar is on the exact opposite side of the room. Make sure it is mostly expensive champagne and just a tiny splash of juice. I do not want cheap filler." I calmly walked over, took her empty glass, and navigated through the crowd of wealthy women to fetch her drink. I was meticulously documenting every single act of disrespect in my mind. When I returned with her freshly poured mimosa, Kendra was loudly bragging to her wealthy aunt about my brother. "Mason is a total corporate visionary," she boasted, her voice echoing off the glass ceiling. "Technova is practically handing him the vice president role on Monday morning because of his raw corporate talent and his brilliant artificial intelligence strategies. He is absolutely essential to their future operations." Her aunt smiled politely, taking a delicate sip of her tea, and then turned her gaze toward me as I handed Kendra the glass. "And what exactly do you do for a living?" Claire the aunt asked, with genuine curiosity. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, Kendra let out a sharp, mocking laugh that silenced the entire table. "Oh, do not ask Claire about her career," Kendra sneered, taking a long sip of her mimosa. "Claire is our little family freeloader. She works at some failing, no-name boutique startup that nobody has ever heard of. Honestly, she is completely dragging down the prestigious image of the Williams family. Mason is the only one in that household with any actual ambition or talent. He is basically carrying her dead weight. If he did not plan on giving her a generous loan next week, she would probably be living on the street." The table erupted in polite, highly condescending chuckles. Several bridesmaids cast pitying glances in my direction. My mother, Catherine, simply nodded eagerly in agreement, completely throwing her own daughter under the bus just to align herself with Kendra's cruel narrative. "That is exactly right," my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We just pray she eventually learns to follow Mason's incredible example." Then Kendra casually reached for a heavily frosted raspberry pastry on her small porcelain plate. As she brought it to her mouth, she intentionally fumbled. The sticky pastry tumbled from her fingers and splattered directly onto the pristine white marble floor, leaving a bright red messy stain right next to her designer heels. A second later, she let her white linen napkin flutter down to the floor, landing right beside the ruined dessert. Kendra looked down at the mess she had deliberately created, and then she looked slowly up at me with a sickeningly sweet, victorious smile. "Oops, how incredibly clumsy of me," she cooed, her eyes gleaming with pure malice. "Claire, be a dear and clean that up right now. We absolutely cannot have anyone slipping in their expensive heels." She pointed her finger directly at the messy floor. "Pick that napkin up for me and wipe up the stain." The bustling noise of the beautiful conservatory began to fade into a sudden, highly tense silence. The clinking of silverware stopped. The quiet whispers of the bridesmaids ceased entirely. Everyone turned to watch me, waiting to see the family failure drop to her knees and scrub the floor for the beautiful bride. I stood perfectly still. I looked down at the ruined red pastry and the discarded white linen napkin on the floor. Then I slowly raised my head. I locked my eyes directly onto Kendra. My posture was perfectly straight, and my expression was as cold and unyielding as solid iron. I did not reach for the napkin. I did not bend my knees. I stared Kendra dead in the eye, and the absolute shift in the room was instantaneous. I did not bend down. I did not apologize. Instead, I calmly walked over to the nearest polished mahogany side table and gently set the heavy champagne tray down. The delicate crystal flutes clinked softly against the wood, a sharp, distinct sound that echoed rapidly through the sudden deafening silence of the glass conservatory. Every single wealthy woman in the room, from Kendra's prominent Atlanta aunts to her elite high society bridesmaids, was staring directly at me, waiting for my total compliance. But my days of absolute compliance were permanently over.
"Pick it up right now," Claire Kendra demanded again, though her voice wavered slightly, completely losing its previous arrogant punch. My mother, entirely panicked by my sudden defiance, hissed under her breath, desperately ordering me to stop causing a public scene. I smoothed the front of my slate gray suit and looked at Kendra with a smile of pure, concentrated pity. "I am not going to clean up your deliberate mess, Kendra," I said, my voice carrying clearly and smoothly across the quiet room. And honestly, it is absolutely fascinating to watch you pretend to be royalty while standing on a rapidly collapsing financial house of cards. Kendra scoffed loudly, but her eyes darted nervously toward her wealthy aunts. "Excuse me? What on earth are you talking about, you bitter little dropout?" I took a slow, calculated step forward, closing the physical distance between us. "You love putting on this grand, expensive performance, do you not?" I continued, my tone smooth and utterly devoid of fear. "You flaunt the custom silk dress, the extravagant mimosa bar, and the massive suburban mansion you keep bragging about to your successful relatives. You demand to be treated like an absolute queen, demanding forced servitude from anyone you blindly deem beneath you. But true wealth does not demand a maid, Kendra. True wealth is completely secure. It does not have to scream for attention at a brunch, and it certainly does not rely on maxed-out credit limits to fund a completely false reality." A collective, highly audible gasp rippled through the seated bridesmaids. Kendra's mother, a highly respected and established socialite in the Atlanta community, sat up completely straight, her elegant expression hardening instantly as she listened closely to my severe words. Kendra's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. "How dare you speak to me like that in front of my family? Mason makes an absolute fortune. He is a top executive in the tech industry." I let out a soft, dismissive chuckle that cut right through her screaming. "Is that what he confidently told you when he financed that expensive diamond ring currently sitting on your finger? Is that what he proudly promised you when he applied for the massive mortgage on that suburban mansion you cannot actually afford? You are marrying a man who projects a flawless illusion of high society while secretly drowning in massive debt, and my parents, who are sitting right here, nodding eagerly at your every single word, have been quietly draining their own retirement accounts just to keep his luxury car from being repossessed by the bank. You genuinely think you are marrying into a wealthy, powerful dynasty today. You are actually marrying a walking financial disaster." The silence that followed my statement was absolute and suffocating. The elegant, high-class morning brunch had been completely shattered into a million pieces. Kendra stood completely frozen in her expensive white silk robe, thoroughly humiliated in front of the very high society relatives she had spent years trying to aggressively impress. My mother looked as though she was going to faint on the spot, her face draining of all color, as the wealthy African-American women around her exchanged highly alarmed, judging whispers. For a long moment, Kendra just stared at me, her chest heaving heavily with unadulterated toxic rage. Then the grand illusion completely snapped. "Get out!"
Kendra screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, completely abandoning her refined, elegant persona. Her face was contorted with pure fury.
Get out of my bridal shower right this second. You are a disgusting, jealous liar. You are completely unfit to be in the presence of my family. I knew you were a pathetic loser, but trying to ruin my wedding day out of sheer, bitter jealousy is a new absolute low. My mother rushed forward, frantically grabbing my arm and trying to physically pull me toward the glass exit doors. "Claire, leave this room immediately!" Catherine yelled, tears of sheer panic and embarrassment welling in her eyes. "You have completely ruined everything. You are permanently banned from the VIP photo session, and you are entirely banned from sitting with the bridal party. Go back to your cheap room and stay entirely out of sight until the ceremony begins." I smoothly and forcefully removed my arm from my mother's desperate tight grip. "Do not worry, Mother. I have absolutely no desire to be in your fake, staged photographs." I turned my calm gaze back to Kendra, who was breathing heavily, tightly surrounded by her thoroughly shocked bridesmaids. "Enjoy the rest of your beautiful morning, Kendra. Enjoy the lavish wedding. Because tomorrow, the financial reality you just confidently called a lie is going to hit you and your new husband like a runaway freight train." I turned my back on the chaotic, screaming scene and walked directly out of the bright, sunlit conservatory. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured, and highly deliberate pace of a woman who was in absolute control of the entire situation. As the heavy glass doors slowly closed behind me, completely cutting off the loud sound of Kendra screaming at her bridesmaids to ignore my ridiculous lies, I felt a deep, profound sense of absolute liberation. The iron boundary had been forcefully drawn. The family toxicity had been permanently rejected. As I walked down the quiet, heavily carpeted hallway toward the main luxury elevator bank, my phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing digital screen. It was a high-priority, fully encrypted email from the Human Resources Executive server at Technova. The critical notification banner flashed bright red. Subject Executive Portfolio Submission. The detailed body of the email was a formal corporate system report. It explicitly confirmed that Mason Williams had just officially logged into the corporate mainframe from his hotel room. He had confidently submitted his complete portfolio for the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives promotion. Attached directly to his digital application was the massive artificial intelligence framework he had aggressively stolen from my hard drive the night before. My brother had actually done it. Driven blindly by his own immense greed and absolute unchecked arrogance, he had proudly presented the stolen data to the Technova Executive Board. He had officially triggered the digital trap. I did not even break my confident stride as I walked onto the empty, mirrored elevator. I quickly tapped the screen of my phone, opening a direct secure reply window to the Chief Human Resources Officer of Technova. The executive board was eagerly waiting for the final approval to legally process the promotions before the start of the new business week. They needed authorization from the absolute top of the corporate ladder. They needed formal authorization from me. I quickly typed my absolute response. Freeze all executive promotions immediately pending a full comprehensive internal audit. Initiate a severe forensic review of the portfolio submitted by Mason Williams. Work attachment for severe federal intellectual property violations. Do not notify the employee under any circumstances. Await my direct command on Monday morning. I pressed send just as the elevator doors opened to the busy lobby level. The email vanished securely into the corporate server, instantly locking down Mason's entire professional future. He was currently getting dressed in a custom tuxedo, happily preparing to stand at the church altar and promise his beautiful bride a lifetime of endless wealth and luxury. He had absolutely no idea that his career was already completely dead, and I was holding the shovel. Let the grand wedding commence. Let the grand wedding commence. I spent the next 2 hours completely off the radar, enjoying a quiet, solitary walk through the bustling streets of Manhattan, entirely detached from the frantic wedding preparations actively consuming my family. My phone remained blissfully silent until exactly noon. I had just ordered a light lunch at a small, unassuming cafe when my secure, encrypted mobile device vibrated heavily against the wooden table. It was not a text message from my furious mother, nor was it a demanding phone call from Kendra. It was a high-priority security intercept from the Apex Holdings dedicated artificial intelligence monitoring system. I unlocked the screen and opened the detailed alert. As the absolute owner of the private equity firm that just acquired Technova, I had legally authorized a complete security mirroring of all executive communications on their server. I wanted to see every single move the current leadership was making before I walked into the boardroom on Monday. Because Mason was a mid-level manager, desperately grasping for an executive promotion, his corporate email account was swept up in the routine data collection. The security alert indicated that Mason Williams was currently broadcasting a highly sensitive bulk email to a curated list of external financial contacts. I opened the intercepted transmission and began to carefully read. Mason was apparently absolutely enraged by my refusal to bow to his wife at the bridal brunch. Kendra must have sprinted straight to his room crying and screaming about how I had publicly humiliated her in front of her elite aunts and wealthy bridesmaids. To protect his incredibly fragile ego and defend his demanding bride, Mason had decided to take immediate, highly aggressive action. He wanted to teach me a permanent lesson. He wanted to destroy my ability to earn a living, so I would be forced to crawl back to my family and beg for financial forgiveness. His method of destruction was incredibly clumsy and deeply pathetic. He had drafted a long, highly defamatory email specifically targeting my professional reputation. The subject line read, "Urgent warning regarding fraudulent investment activities." He had used a supposedly anonymous sender address, but he was so incredibly arrogant and technologically incompetent that he had routed the entire transmission directly through the Technova corporate server. Any basic network administrator could easily trace the origin IP address straight back to his designated hotel room. I read the contents of his desperate email. It was a masterpiece of pure delusion. "To whom it may concern," the email began, "it has come to my attention that a supposedly legitimate financial consultant named Claire Williams is attempting to solicit capital from your esteemed institutions. I am a senior technology executive with deep ties to the New York financial sector, and I feel it is my professional duty to warn you about her illicit operations. Her tiny, unnamed boutique firm is completely failing. She is currently drowning in massive personal debt and has a known history of severe mental instability. Any financial projections she provides are completely fabricated. She does not have the backing, the capital, or the corporate talent to manage your portfolios. I highly advise you to terminate all professional relationships with her firm immediately, before she drags your prestigious company into a massive federal fraud investigation." He had essentially compiled a list of the largest, most powerful investment funds on Wall Street. He had meticulously scraped the private contact information of senior partners, managing directors, and chief executive officers at massive global asset management groups. He had spent his valuable pre-wedding hours furiously typing out this pathetic revenge fantasy. He genuinely believed that if he fired off a few anonymous warnings, wrapped in fake corporate concern, these massive financial titans would instantly panic. He thought they would immediately sever their contracts with my supposedly tiny startup, revoke any funding I had secured, and completely ruin my career. He wanted me fired, publicly disgraced, and financially ruined by Monday morning. He wanted to ensure that when he was handed his vice president title at Technova, I would be standing in the unemployment line, entirely dependent on his financial mercy. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, a genuine, uncontrollable smile spreading across my face. The sheer, breathtaking irony of his sabotage attempt was almost too perfect to believe.
Mason thought he was throwing a devastating punch in a heavyweight boxing match, completely unaware that he had just punched a solid steel wall with his bare hands. The fatal flaw in his grand revenge plan was his absolute blinding ignorance of my actual position in the global corporate hierarchy. Mason assumed my firm was a desperate, scrambling startup, begging for table scraps from the major Wall Street players. He assumed I was a low-level consultant, desperately pitching for tiny accounts to keep the lights on in a rented office space. He based his entire reality on the false narrative our parents had constructed to make him feel superior. What my arrogant brother failed to realize was that those specific Wall Street investment funds were not my clients. They were not institutions I was trying to blindly pitch or beg for capital. Those massive multi-billion-dollar funds were the closest limited partners of Apex Holdings. We did not work for them. We actively co-invested with them. The senior managing partners of those funds were my direct peers, my close strategic allies, and my personal friends. We routinely collaborated on massive corporate buyouts, aggressive hedge fund strategies, and hostile takeovers that actively shifted the global markets. I was not their subordinate. In many joint ventures, I was their lead negotiator. Mason had just sent an anonymous defamatory email calling the chairman of Apex Holdings a desperate fraud. He had sent it directly to the exact billionaires who had personally wired me hundreds of millions of dollars just 3 days ago to help fund the Technova acquisition. He was essentially emailing my closest business allies, trying to convince them that the woman who just orchestrated one of the largest technology buyouts of the entire fiscal year was secretly broke and running a petty scam out of a cheap hotel room. It was the digital equivalent of a toddler throwing a pebble at a battleship. The profound, quiet satisfaction washing over me was absolute. I did not need to block the email. I did not need to intercept the transmission or rush to mitigate the supposed damage. I simply let the corporate server process his vindictive request. I watched the digital progress bar on my encrypted screen turn a bright, solid green, indicating that his defamatory blast had successfully reached the private inboxes of some of the most ruthless, powerful financial titans in the country. I set my phone face down on the wooden cafe table and finished my lunch in complete, undisturbed peace. Mason had intended to trigger an avalanche that would completely bury my career and shatter my reputation. Instead, he had just painted a massive, glowing red target on his own back for the most dangerous predators in the financial district. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. The men and women receiving that email did not tolerate anonymous threats, and they certainly did not tolerate mid-level corporate managers attempting to blindly smear their most profitable private equity partner. I paid my bill, leaving a generous cash tip on the table, and stepped back out into the bright afternoon sun. I headed slowly back to the luxury hotel to prepare for the main event. The stage was perfectly set, the trap was fully loaded. Now I just had to wait for my phone to inevitably ring. I did not have to wait very long. I was only half a block away from the grand entrance of the Plaza Hotel when my secure mobile device began to vibrate continuously in my hand. The caller identification screen displayed an encrypted international number, but I recognized the routing code instantly. It was Richard Sterling, the senior managing partner of Sterling Vanguard, one of the largest and most aggressive hedge funds in the global market. Richard was a man who moved billions of dollars before his morning coffee, and he was currently one of my primary co-investors in the Technova acquisition. I swiped the screen to answer and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not even get the chance to say hello before a booming laugh echoed through the speaker. "Claire, my absolute favorite titan of industry," Richard shouted, his voice thick with genuine amusement. "Please tell me you are currently looking at the absolute garbage that just hit my private server." I smiled, keeping my pace steady as I approached the hotel courtyard. "I assume you are referring to the anonymous whistleblower, attempting to save your fund from my devastating financial incompetence, I replied smoothly. Richard laughed even harder, the sound joined by the distinct chuckling of at least two other men in the background. He had put me on speakerphone in his executive boardroom. You have completely outdone yourself this time, Claire. We are sitting here reviewing the final capital allocation for the Technova buyout, and suddenly my security team flags an anonymous email sent from a mid-level Technova manager. The idiot is trying to warn us that Apex Holdings is a massive fraud.
He says you are broke and mentally unstable. Jonathan from Global Risk Assessment is sitting right next to me, and he practically spit out his scotch. Who on earth is Mason Williams, and why does he have a massive death wish? I paused near the edge of a large stone fountain outside the hotel, watching the water cascade smoothly over the marble tiers. Mason Williams is my older brother, I stated, my voice completely devoid of any familial warmth. He is a mid-level manager at Technova who is currently preparing to get married in about 4 hours. He is incredibly angry with me because I refused to act as a personal servant to his bride this morning. So, in his infinite corporate wisdom, he decided to leverage the Technova server to anonymously destroy my reputation with the major Wall Street players. He thinks my firm is a tiny startup, and he wants you to fire me. A stunned, heavy silence fell over the conference line for a brief second before the entire boardroom erupted into chaotic, hysterical laughter. I could hear Jonathan wheezing in the background. Your brother Richard finally gasped, completely beside himself. Your own brother is trying to tank a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm by sending a blind email to the exact people funding your acquisitions. That is the most spectacular display of absolute arrogance I have ever witnessed in my 30 years on Wall Street. Do you want my legal team to crush him into dust? We can have a defamation lawsuit filed and his bank accounts frozen before he even puts on his tuxedo. I appreciate the offer, Richard, but I handle my own garbage, I replied, my tone shifting from mild amusement to absolute razor-sharp authority. Let him think his little sabotage attempt was a massive success. Do not respond to the email. Do not block his server access yet. I want him walking down the aisle today feeling completely victorious. I am taking total control of the Technova Executive Board on Monday morning, and I have a very specific public execution planned for my dear brother. Just ensure the final acquisition funds are fully cleared for Monday. Consider it done, Claire Richards said, his tone instantly returning to absolute professional respect. Have a wonderful weekend at the wedding. We look forward to watching you clean house next week. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Mason had completely crossed the line from petty sibling rivalry into actionable corporate treason. It was finally time to formalize his destruction. I walked through the revolving doors of the hotel lobby, ignoring the wealthy guests, and dialed a highly secure internal number for Apex Holdings. The call connected instantly to my lead corporate counsel. Good afternoon, Claire, the attorney answered promptly. I kept my voice incredibly sharp as I navigated the crowded lobby. Prepare a termination dossier for Mason Williams, I ordered. Add gross corporate misconduct, severe defamation, and federal intellectual property theft to the list of absolute offenses. He just attempted to distribute false financial warnings to our primary investors using the Technova corporate network. I want a comprehensive legal binder detailing every single violation, fully drafted, printed, and legally sealed. Have it ready and delivered to me by tonight. Understood completely, the attorney replied without a single moment of hesitation. Will we be involving federal authorities regarding the intellectual property theft? Not until I publicly fire him in front of his entire new family, I stated coldly. Prepare the civil lawsuits for damages and draft a formal restraining order completely banning him from all Technova and Apex Holdings properties. I want the dossier airtight. He will not get a single dime of severance. He will lose all his unvested stock options, and he will carry the legal liability for the data breach. Make sure the paperwork is absolutely flawless. I ended the call and stepped into the elevator to head up to my room. The gears of his total ruin were now fully in motion, guided by the most ruthless legal minds in the country. Mason thought he could use his imaginary corporate power to force me onto my knees. He had absolutely no idea that I had just legally authorized the complete demolition of his entire life. I walked down the dim hallway and swiped my keycard. As the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind me, the suffocating silence of the cheap room felt like the calm before a devastating hurricane. I opened my small suitcase and pulled out the plain, unbranded dress my mother had practically forced me to wear. It was time to go watch the Golden Child seal his fate. I pulled the unbranded navy dress over my head. It was the cheap garment my mother ordered me to wear, so I would not outshine the wealthy bridesmaids. I paired it with simple black heels and walked out of my room, ready to witness the climax of their manufactured fairy tale. The wedding was held at a massive stone church, a venue that practically screamed elite American high society. Professional photographers swarmed the front steps, capturing every moment of Kendra's opulent arrival. I stepped into the cavernous interior. The decorations were staggering in their sheer excess. Thousands of white roses cascaded down ancient stone pillars. A string quartet played from the balcony. The pews were rapidly filling with Atlanta's elite and New York's corporate climbers in expensive silk and tailored suits. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my cheap dress standing out like a harsh stain against the sea of immense wealth. I kept my posture straight, ignoring the condescending whispers and judging glances from guests who recognized me as the supposed family failure. I reached the front row, the velvet-roped section reserved for immediate families. A gold foil seating chart was displayed on an ornate silver stand. I scanned the heavy cardstock looking for my seat next to my parents. I found my name printed in elegant calligraphy, but my name had been violently crossed out. A thick, jagged line of black Sharpie ink was slashed repeatedly across my elegant name, practically tearing the expensive paper in half. It was a vicious public defacement designed to humiliate me. I stood, frozen, staring at the black ink. The sheer disrespect was staggering. Before I could locate an usher, a harsh, panicked grip clamped down on my left arm. I whipped around to see my mother, Catherine. Her face was flushed, dark red, glaring at me with unadulterated venom. Her long nails bit into my bare arm as she physically yanked me away from the pristine velvet rope. "What on earth are you doing standing up here?" Catherine hissed, her voice a desperate whisper. She was terrified of making a scene in front of Kendra's prominent aunts who watched our interaction with cold amusement. "I explicitly told you to stay out of sight after the disgusting spectacle you caused this morning." I glanced down at her trembling hand gripping my arm. "I am simply trying to find my seat in the family pew, Mother," I replied, my voice perfectly calm. "But it appears someone took a permanent marker to the gold foil seating chart." My mother did not even blink. She roughly shoved my shoulder, physically steering me backward away from the luxurious front row. "You do not have a seat in the family pew," she snapped her words, dripping with absolute disgust. "Kendra was completely hysterical after you viciously insulted her financial status. She demanded you be entirely removed from the front of the church. You are an absolute eyesore in that cheap off-the-rack dress. You will completely ruin the professional VIP photos, and Mason will look like a fool, having his failed sister sitting behind him at the altar." She forcefully pushed me back down the long center aisle away from the beautiful white orchids. We marched past row after row of wealthy guests, moving further back into the cathedral. We did not stop until we reached the very last row of wooden pews, shoved tight against the heavy oak exit doors, draped in the dark, cold shadows of the upper balcony. It was the section typically reserved for overflow guests, barely considered worth an invitation. "Sit down right here and absolutely do not move until the ceremony is completely over," Catherine ordered, pointing a shaking finger at an empty space at the end of the dark wooden bench. You are sitting next to strangers. Do not speak to them. Do not ruin this perfect day for your brother. When the ceremony concludes, you are to leave this church through the back exit immediately. You are strictly banned from the reception. I looked at the dark, isolated corner where she had just banished her only daughter. Then I looked at my mother, who was vibrating with pathetic loyalty to a son currently drowning in secret debt. I did not yell. I simply offered her a cool, completely hollow smile. "Enjoy the beautiful ceremony, Mother," I said softly. "Take wonderful photographs. You will want to remember exactly how Mason looks today." Catherine sneered one last time before practically sprinting back up the aisle. I calmly sat down on the hard bench. I ignored the awkward glances of the strangers next to me, crossed my legs, and leaned back against the cool wood. My posture was perfectly relaxed, exuding absolute control. The heavy pipe organ suddenly roared to life, signaling the start of the procession. I watched from the distant shadows as Mason strutted confidently down the aisle, wearing a tailored tuxedo he absolutely could not afford, his chest puffed out with blinding arrogance. Kendra followed in her custom silk gown, playing the flawless princess to perfection. From my isolated seat by the doors, the scene looked like a beautifully staged theatrical tragedy. I sat completely still in the dark, watching my family enthusiastically celebrate a total financial lie. They had pushed me to the edge of the room and violently crossed my name out of their elite circle. They thought they had finally defeated me. But as I sat there listening to the priest begin the sacred vows, I felt no anger. I only felt the cold, hard certainty of the execution order sitting securely in my lawyer's briefcase. I smiled in the shadows, perfectly relaxed, patiently waiting for the trap to spring wide open. The grand illusion was intoxicating for them, a fleeting moment of absolute triumph built entirely on fragile, shattered glass. They were reveling in their artificial glory, completely blind to the massive corporate slaughter that I was personally unleashing on Monday morning. The heavy pipe organ music slowly faded into a soft, reverent hum, echoing against the vaulted stone ceilings of the massive cathedral. The priest raised his hands, officially gesturing for the hundreds of wealthy attendees to take their seats. The rustle of expensive silk and the soft murmur of high society guests settled into a thick, expectant silence. Up at the altar, Mason puffed out his chest, looking down at his bride with a sickeningly smug expression. He genuinely believed he had conquered the world. He genuinely believed his stolen portfolio was currently cementing his promotion to vice president, entirely unaware that the digital guillotine was already hovering directly over his neck. Just as the priest opened his mouth to deliver the opening blessing, a sudden, sharp sound shattered the perfect tranquility of the church. The massive, heavy oak exit doors, right next to my dark, isolated pew, were violently pushed open. A loud gasp rippled through the back rows as a man practically stumbled into the cathedral vestibule. It was Richard Harrison, the chief executive officer of Technova. Under normal circumstances, Harrison was a picture of Silicon Valley intimidation. He usually commanded boardrooms with a terrifying, icy calm, always dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored suits. But today, he looked like a man actively fleeing a burning building. His expensive silver tie was yanked entirely sideways. His forehead was covered in a heavy, glistening sheen of cold sweat. His breath was coming in ragged, heavy gasps, and he was desperately clutching a leather corporate portfolio to his chest, as if his absolute life depended on it. Despite the sheer disruption of his frantic arrival, my mother, Catherine, immediately recognized him from her desperate internet research into Mason's company. Her eyes widened in absolute shock and immediate, overwhelming greed. She completely abandoned any sense of church decorum,
Sitting in the pristine velvet front row, she aggressively leaned out into the center aisle and began waving her hand frantically in the air. She flashed a sickeningly wide, eager smile, violently gesturing toward an empty seat right next to her in the elite VIP section. She was practically vibrating with desperate social climbing energy, desperate to show the prominent Atlanta families that her son was so incredibly important that his billionaire CEO had personally flown across the country just to attend his wedding. Up at the altar, Mason finally noticed the commotion at the back of the church. He saw his chief executive officer standing in the vestibule. Mason's smug grin widened into a massive, arrogant beam of pure triumph. He slightly nudged Kendra, aggressively whispering that his boss had arrived to witness his ascension. Mason stood taller, adjusting his rented tuxedo lapels, fully expecting Harrison to march straight down the center aisle and take a place of ultimate honor in the front row. But Richard Harrison did not even glance at the altar. He completely ignored the desperate, frantic waving of my mother in the front row. He did not care about the beautiful bride, the cascading white roses, or the deeply annoyed glare of the priest. Harrison was aggressively scanning the massive sea of faces, his eyes darting frantically from row to row, actively searching for one specific person. He looked completely terrified. Then his frantic gaze shifted to the dark, heavily shadowed corner by the exit doors. His eyes locked directly onto my calm, seated figure. The sheer, overwhelming wave of relief that instantly washed over the CEO's face was entirely palpable. Harrison completely bypassed the grand center aisle. He practically sprinted down the narrow, unadorned side aisle, completely ignoring the stunned, outraged whispers of the wealthy guests. He walked right past the elegant velvet ropes. He completely ignored Mason, who was currently staring at him with a deeply confused, open mouth. Harrison rushed directly to the very back row, stopping right in front of the cheap wooden overflow bench where my mother had viciously banished me just 10 minutes earlier. The strangers sitting next to me physically recoiled as the billionaire chief executive officer stopped abruptly in front of us. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his wrinkled suit jacket. Then, in front of hundreds of elite guests, Richard Harrison bowed his head deeply. It was not a polite nod. It was a posture of total, absolute subservience to the new chairman of his entire corporate empire. He leaned down, placing one hand heavily on the back of the wooden pew, and brought his face directly down to my ear. "Ms. Williams Harrison," whispered, his voice trembling violently with unchecked corporate terror. "I apologize profoundly for interrupting this personal family event, but we have a catastrophic emergency at the corporate headquarters. You issued a direct executive order to freeze all human resources promotions this morning." I kept my eyes fixed casually on the altar, watching my family stare in absolute paralyzed confusion. "Yes, Richard," I replied smoothly, keeping my voice incredibly low and calm. "I ordered a complete freeze, pending an internal audit. Did you not comprehend the directive?" "I comprehended it entirely," Chairman Harrison stammered desperately. "But less than an hour ago, my executive risk management team intercepted a massive security breach. An anonymous employee used our internal servers to mass distribute a highly defamatory email to our most critical Wall Street financial partners. The partners at Sterling Vanguard just contacted my office. They are threatening to completely pull out of the multi-billion-dollar acquisition unless we identify the rogue employee immediately. I flew here directly on the corporate jet to get your explicit authorization to initiate a federal network trace. I cannot authorize a federal investigation into our own servers without the signature of the chairman of Apex Holdings." I smiled a tiny, ruthless curve of my lips. "You do not need to initiate a blind federal trace," Richard I whispered back, finally turning my head to look directly into his terrified eyes. "I already know exactly who sent the email. I have the entire digital log securely saved on my personal server." Harrison's eyes went completely wide. "You know who the rogue employee is?" he asked, his voice shaking with sheer disbelief. "I do," I replied quietly. "But I am not giving you his name right now. You will return to your jet, fly back to the headquarters, and wait for me to arrive on Monday morning. I will personally handle the rogue employee in the executive boardroom. You are explicitly forbidden from taking any further action until I walk through those corporate doors. Do you understand my direct command?" Harrison swallowed hard, visibly trembling under my cold gaze. "Yes, Chairman, absolutely. I will prepare the boardroom for your immediate arrival on Monday." He bowed to me one more time, completely ignoring everyone else in the entire church. He turned on his heel and rushed right back out the heavy oak doors, disappearing into the bright afternoon sunlight as quickly as he had arrived. The heavy exit doors slammed shut, plunging the back of the church into quiet shadows once again. A thick, deeply confused silence hung over the entire cathedral. Up at the front of the church, my mother looked physically ill. Her arm was still awkwardly frozen in the air from waving. At the altar, Mason and Kendra were exchanging highly bewildered, panicked glances. They had just watched the most powerful man in Mason's professional life completely ignore them, sprint to the overflow seating, bow to the family failure, and rapidly flee the building. But the absolute narcissism of my brother quickly overpowered his sudden confusion. I watched Mason forcefully swallow his panic and plaster his arrogant smile back onto his face. He leaned over and quickly whispered something into Kendra's ear. I knew exactly what ridiculous lie he was feeding her. He was convincing himself that Harrison had simply gotten lost in the massive church, mistook me for a church employee, and asked for directions to the restroom. He was violently rationalizing the sheer impossibility of what he had just witnessed, desperately keeping his grand illusion completely intact for just a few more hours. The priest cleared his throat loudly, awkwardly resuming the ceremony. I leaned back into the hard wooden bench, my cheap navy dress blending perfectly into the dark shadows, and prepared to watch my brother gleefully sign his own legal death warrant. The extravagant reception began 2 hours after the ceremony concluded, held in the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive country club. The venue was a blinding display of excessive floral arrangements and gold-plated tableware. I walked into the dimly lit ballroom and saw exactly where my family had placed me. I was exiled to a tiny, wobbly circular table shoved aggressively into the darkest corner of the room, located directly next to the loudly swinging kitchen doors. I sat down gracefully, my cheap navy dress a stark contrast to the dazzling evening gowns swirling around the room. I simply ordered a glass of sparkling water, sat back, and watched the expensive charade unfold with the cold, calculated patience of a predator observing its oblivious prey. For the first 2 hours, the reception was a continuous display of manufactured perfection. Mason and Kendra made their grand entrance to a blasting hip-hop anthem. They cut the massive wedding cake and danced their highly choreographed first dance. Through it all, Kendra's wealthy African-American aunts watched with polite smiles, clearly calculating the total cost of the party. Mason was sweating profusely, desperately needing them to believe he belonged in their elite tax bracket. When the heavy-plated dinner was cleared away, the loud music slowly faded out. The intricate crystal chandeliers dimmed slightly, and a single bright spotlight hit the center of the polished wooden dance floor. Mason confidently grabbed a wireless microphone from the DJ booth, tapped it twice to ensure absolute silence, and flashed his most arrogant smile at the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate the most incredible day of my entire life," Mason began, his voice booming through the expensive sound system. He launched into a lengthy monologue about his immense love for Kendra, heavily peppered with obnoxious bragging about their massively mortgaged suburban mansion. He spoke passionately about his skyrocketing career, heavily implying that he single-handedly ran the corporate infrastructure at Technova. The wealthy guests clapped politely. But Mason wanted more than just polite clapping. He needed a prop to elevate himself in front of his new high society family, and he knew exactly who he wanted to use. Mason slowly turned his body and aggressively scanned the dark perimeter of the massive ballroom. When his eyes finally locked onto my isolated table by the swinging kitchen doors, a malicious, triumphant grin spread across his face. "I want to take a special moment tonight to thank my poor sister Claire for showing up," Mason sneered directly into the microphone. The bright spotlight instantly swung away from the dance floor and violently illuminated my tiny table in the dark corner. Hundreds of wealthy guests turned their heads, staring at the family failure. I did not flinch. I stared directly back at my brother, my face a completely blank mask. "I know things have been incredibly tough for you lately." Mason continued pacing slowly across the dance floor. Even though her career is stuck at the bottom of a no-name firm, she still managed to scrape together enough for a dress. A low collective wave of awkward chuckles rippled through the massive ballroom. My mother, seated proudly at the prominent family table, covered her mouth and giggled aggressively. "But do not worry, sis," he practically shouted into the microphone, pointing a highly arrogant finger directly at my face. "When I make vice president on Monday morning, I will float you alone. We absolutely cannot have a Williams living on the streets." The ballroom completely erupted. The polite chuckles immediately morphed into loud, raucous laughter. Several groomsmen aggressively slammed their hands on their tables. Sitting right next to Mason, Kendra smiled broadly. It was a vicious, triumphant smirk of pure victory. She looked at me with immense satisfaction, firmly believing she had successfully established the absolute social hierarchy. The spotlight remained fixed blindingly on my face, waiting for me to break down or run crying out of the heavy doors. I did none of those things. I slowly picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water. I raised it gracefully in the air, offering a completely silent toast to his massive ego. I took a slow, elegant sip, swallowed smoothly, and set the glass back down on the table. The freezing calmness of my reaction caused the loud laughter in the room to slowly die down. Mason frowned slightly, unnerved that his devastating punchline had not instantly shattered me. He quickly turned away, gesturing for the DJ to blast the heavy dance music once again. The bright spotlight violently snapped off my face, plunging me back into the quiet shadows. I sat in the dark, listening to the heavy bass shake the floorboards. I was not humiliated. I was experiencing a level of pure anticipation that was almost intoxicating. Mason had just publicly staked his entire reputation and financial future on his highly anticipated Monday morning promotion. He aggressively broadcasted his grand corporate victory to hundreds of elite witnesses. He had tied his entire identity to a job title he was never going to receive. I mentally reviewed the heavily encrypted termination dossier currently sitting on my secure desk at Apex Holdings. The gross corporate misconduct, the severe defamation, the massive federal intellectual property theft. Mason had absolutely no idea that the terrified chief executive officer who bowed to me was currently preparing the boardroom for my hostile arrival. I watched Mason grab his beautiful bride and spin her aggressively around the dance floor, completely blind to the catastrophic corporate slaughter waiting for him. I finished my sparkling water, picked up my small black clutch, and stood up from the tiny wobbly table in the dark corner. I had gathered all the necessary legal evidence of their absolute disrespect. I walked quietly out of the side exit, completely unnoticed by the heavily intoxicated guests, and stepped out into the cool night air. It was time to go to war. I did not walk out the heavy doors. As my hand touched the cold brass handle of the side exit, a busy waiter rushed past and instinctively handed me a full crystal glass of dark red white wine. I turned slowly back toward the glowing dance floor. I calmly took a sip of my red wine. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not cry. My gaze was pure ice, fixed entirely on the pathetic spectacle unfolding directly before me. Mason was still pacing the polished wood, entirely consumed by his own massive ego. My brilliant, $1 million artificial intelligence pitch is going to completely revolutionize the corporate structure at Technova, Mason boasted loudly, his voice echoing off the expensive crystal chandeliers. It is a totally flawless system. When I officially secure my vice president role on Monday, I am going to take this entire family straight to the absolute top of the financial world. The wealthy crowd erupted into another round of enthusiastic applause. Kendra beamed with intense pride, clapping her hands gracefully. But the loud applause abruptly died. At the most prominent table near the stage, a tall figure suddenly pushed his chair back with an aggressive scrape against the floor. It was Richard Harrison. The chief executive officer of Technova had clearly ignored my order to leave town, and had instead quietly slipped into the reception hall. He was currently watching a mid-level manager publicly claim ownership of severely stolen intellectual property. Harrison abruptly stood up. His face was incredibly grim, his posture rigid with pure fury. He did not wait for an invitation. He walked directly onto the brightly illuminated stage, his heavy footsteps echoing through the entirely silent ballroom. Mason turned around, his arrogant smile freezing instantly. He looked thoroughly bewildered as the billionaire CEO furiously approached him. "Mr. Harrison, I did not realize you stayed for the reception," Mason stammered nervously, frantically trying to regain his falsely confident composure. "Would you like to say a few words regarding my upcoming promotion to the board?" Harrison did not smile. He did not offer a polite congratulation to the groom. Instead, he reached out and violently snatched the expensive wireless microphone right out of Mason's trembling hand. The sudden feedback screeched incredibly loudly through the massive speakers, causing several wealthy guests in the front row to physically flinch in genuine terror. Harrison turned his back on Mason completely and faced the massive sea of terrified guests. "I apologize to the guests," Harrison announced, his deep voice echoing aggressively in the hall. "But I cannot stand here and allow a grave, factual error to be broadcast at this event. There is absolutely no brilliant artificial intelligence pitch authored by this man. There is absolutely no upcoming executive promotion waiting for him on Monday. The only thing waiting for Mason Williams is a devastating federal indictment and the immediate, permanent termination of his employment at my company. Security, please escort him out of this building immediately. Tonight." The heavy doors of the ballroom remained firmly closed. Not a single security guard moved. The entire room of wealthy, elite guests was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public execution taking place on the brilliantly lit stage. Mason stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to process the total destruction of his completely fabricated reality. He looked wildly around the room, desperately hoping this was some kind of elaborate wedding day prank. But Richard Harrison was completely deadly serious. The billionaire CEO did not break his furious gaze away from the shocked crowd. He slowly raised his left arm, extending his hand and pointing his index finger directly across the massive ballroom. He pointed past the expensive floral centerpieces, past the panicked faces of the high society bridesmaids, and straight into the dark, isolated corner where I was standing, perfectly still, with a crystal glass of red wine in my hand. "Please allow me to introduce the actual visionary in this room," Harrison announced, his voice vibrating with absolute, undeniable reverence. "Please allow me to introduce Claire Williams. She is the founder and chairman of Apex Holdings. That is the multi-billion-dollar private equity firm that officially acquired Technova for $150 million yesterday morning. She completely orchestrated the entire buyout. She legally owns every single patent, every single server, and every single employee contract. She is my absolute superior. Harrison finally turned his head to look directly at the groom. The absolute disgust on his face was staggering. And Mason Harrison concluded his words echoing like physical gunshots. She officially owns the company you currently work for. You just attempted to steal her intellectual property to impress your bride. You are entirely finished. The reception hall instantly dropped into a dead, suffocating silence. The loud, pulsing energy of the expensive celebration was violently extinguished in a matter of seconds. Hundreds of people stopped breathing at exactly the same time. The sheer, overwhelming shockwave of the incredible revelation hit the room like a physical explosion. At the front table, Kendra stood up. Her custom silk gown rustled loudly in the deafening quiet. She was staring at me with wide, completely terrified eyes, the absolute reality of her massive financial ruin rapidly washing over her. The heavy, crystal champagne glass slipped completely out of her trembling hand. It plummeted to the pristine white marble floor, shattering loudly into 1,000 sparkling pieces. The sharp, violent crash echoed through the paralyzed ballroom. My parents, Catherine and Thomas, were completely glued to their expensive chairs. The color violently drained from their faces, leaving them looking pale and physically ill. They had spent their entire lives worshiping their golden sun and fiercely banishing their daughter to the shadows. Now they were brutally forced to realize they had actively funded a catastrophic failure while aggressively mocking the absolute ruler of his corporate empire. They were nothing but collateral damage. I stepped out from the shadows of my isolated corner. The ballroom remained completely paralyzed in a state of absolute, suffocating silence. The only sound in the massive hall was the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels against the polished wood floor. I walked slowly and deliberately. The wealthy guests seated at the tables physically shrank back as I passed them. They parted like the ocean, desperately pulling their expensive chairs out of my direct path. They were staring at me as if I were a ghost that had just materialized to drag the groom straight to hell. I reached the edge of the brilliantly lit stage and ascended the short wooden staircase. I did not rush. I walked directly up to Mason, who was trembling so violently that the expensive fabric of his rented tuxedo was shaking. I looked directly into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. His arrogant, superior facade had completely melted away, leaving nothing but a hollow, desperate shell of a man who suddenly realized he was standing on a trap door. "You are right, Mason," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room, without the need for a microphone. "My firm is quite small. It only had enough loose cash to buy your entire career." Mason swallowed hard, a thick bead of cold sweat rolling rapidly down his pale forehead. He looked frantically at Richard Harrison, then at Kendra, and finally back at me. He desperately tried to force a highly unnatural, breathy chuckle, attempting to salvage his dignity in front of his wealthy new family members. "Claire, please," Mason stammered, his voice cracking entirely. "This is just a massive family misunderstanding. You are taking a simple joke way too seriously. We are at my wedding reception. We can figure this all out later." He took a frantic step forward and desperately reached out, clamping his sweating hand tightly onto my forearm. "Please, Claire, just sit down so we can talk about this as a family." I looked down at his shaking hand gripping my arm. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of his sudden plea for loyalty was almost laughable.
The man who had viciously banished me to the back of the church and publicly humiliated me for a cheap laugh was now desperately begging for mercy. He was rapidly drowning, and he was violently thrashing around, trying to pull me under the water with him. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, exuding absolute corporate authority. I did not break eye contact with him. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see if the powerful billionaire chairman would actually yield to her pathetic brother. I let the heavy silence stretch out for 5 agonizing seconds, letting the cold reality of his total financial execution sink deep into his fragile bones. And then I firmly pulled my arm away from his desperate grasp, leaving him standing alone on the stage in front of everyone. He was now completely and utterly destroyed, with no escape left. He was now completely and utterly destroyed, with no escape left. I did not step back. I did not lower my voice. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once. The sharp sound cut through the dead air of the ballroom. Instantly, the heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the country club swung wide open. My lead corporate counsel, a towering, sharply dressed man named Marcus, strode confidently into the room. He completely ignored the sea of terrified wealthy guests. He carried a massive, thick, black leather binder under his arm. He walked directly past the heavily decorated tables, ascended the stage stairs, and slammed the massive legal dossier directly onto the center of the head table. The heavy thud rattled the crystal champagne flutes and echoed violently through the silent hall. Marcus stepped back, folding his arms perfectly across his chest. I looked at Mason, who was currently staring at the black binder as if it were a live explosive device. "We are not a family right now, Mason," I stated, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "We are entirely in the realm of corporate law, and you are a rogue employee who just committed professional suicide." I turned my body to face the massive crowd. Kendra's prominent aunts were clutching their expensive pearls, their faces frozen in absolute shock. My mother was silently weeping into a white cloth napkin, her entire body shaking as she finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of her golden child's failure. My father Thomas stared blankly at the floor. The horrifying realization that his entire retirement fund was tied to a disgraced criminal washing over him like acid. For those of you who just listened to my brother confidently brag about his brilliant $1 million artificial intelligence pitch, allow me to provide some necessary factual clarity. I announced clearly, Mason does not know how to code. Mason does not understand advanced algorithms. The artificial intelligence framework he submitted to the Technova executive board on Friday night was entirely stolen. He unlawfully accessed my private, heavily encrypted hard drive while I was asleep in my hotel room. He illegally copied proprietary software owned directly by Apex Holdings. He then attached that stolen data to his corporate portfolio and proudly uploaded it to the Technova mainframe, falsely claiming it as his own original creation. A loud collective gasp erupted from the high society guests. Kendra's jaw practically unhinged. Her eyes darted frantically toward her new husband, desperately, silently begging him to deny the devastating accusations. She had just signed a legally binding marriage license, legally tying her massive wedding debt to a man who was now a confessed corporate thief. Mason opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable weight of the evidence sitting directly in front of him. "But my brother is incredibly incompetent," I continued, my voice smooth and lethal. "He did not realize that the proprietary software he stole was heavily coded with a dormant cybersecurity protocol. The absolute second he blindly uploaded my intellectual property into the Technova system, he actively triggered a massive internal security breach.
The malware immediately locked down the executive servers and flagged his designated hotel IP address for severe unauthorized data manipulation. He essentially handed me the digital murder weapon, with his own fingerprints pressed firmly all over the handle. I took a slow step closer to Mason. He physically recoiled, pressing his back aggressively against the expensive floral arrangements on the head table. "You told everyone here that I was mentally unstable," I whispered coldly, making sure the microphone on the table picked up every single syllable. "You sent an anonymous, highly defamatory email to my primary Wall Street investors, desperately trying to get me fired from my own multi-billion-dollar equity firm. You demanded that I fetch champagne for your bride and clean up her deliberately dropped pastries. You violently crossed my name off the family seating chart. You genuinely thought this was a petty sibling rivalry that you were finally winning." I paused, letting the crushing reality of his actions sink deeply into the silent room. But in the ruthless corporate world, stealing highly classified intellectual property and uploading encrypted malware onto a global server is not a sibling rivalry. "Mason," I stated, my eyes locking onto his terrified face with the intensity of an apex predator. "It is a severe federal crime." As the heavy words settled over the terrified crowd, Richard Harrison stepped forward, taking his place right next to my lead counsel. The billionaire chief executive officer looked at Mason with a level of pure, concentrated disgust that made the groom physically flinch backward. Mason Williams Harrison boomed his voice, carrying absolute, undeniable authority. "Per the direct executive order of the chairman of Apex Holdings, your employment at Technova is officially terminated, effective immediately. You are permanently stripped of all unvested stock options. You are completely denied any severance package. All of your corporate healthcare and financial benefits are immediately revoked. You will not receive a single dime from this company ever again. Furthermore, our legal department is currently filing a massive civil lawsuit against you for corporate espionage, defamation, and severe intellectual property theft." Harrison gestured sharply toward the black binder on the table. "The official termination documents and the federal injunctions are inside that dossier. You are legally barred from ever stepping foot on any property owned by Technova or Apex Holdings. If you attempt to access our servers, contact our investors, or speak to the press, we will actively bury you in so much aggressive litigation that your future grandchildren will be paying off the legal settlements. You are entirely finished in the technology sector. Nobody will ever hire you again." The brutal, highly public termination was absolute. Mason's legs finally gave out. He collapsed backward into his heavily decorated wooden chair, his face buried deeply in his trembling hands. A low, pathetic sob tore out of his throat, echoing loudly through the microphone on the table. The powerful, arrogant executive who had just promised to float me a pity loan was now publicly sobbing on his wedding stage, utterly stripped of his job, his false wealth, and his entire future. The trap had not just sprung shut. It had completely shattered every single bone in his body. I stood over him, my slate-gray eyes perfectly calm, watching the golden child burn to absolute ash. The deafening silence that had gripped the massive ballroom finally snapped. It did not break with a quiet whisper, but with a sudden, violent explosion of sheer, unadulterated chaos. My mother, Catherine, let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed harshly off the expensive crystal chandeliers. She aggressively knocked over her heavy wooden chair in her frantic rush toward the stage, the intricate layers of her expensive silk dress tangling wildly around her ankles. My father, Thomas, was right behind her. His face flushed a dangerous mottled crimson as he stomped across the pristine marble floor. "Claire, you stop this absolute madness right now!" my mother screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic as she frantically scrambled up the wooden stairs. She forcefully threw herself between me and Mason, acting as if I were holding a loaded physical weapon to his head.
You tell Mr. Harrison to give him his executive job back immediately. This is your brother. This is your own flesh and blood. You are ruining his entire life over a stupid, petty corporate misunderstanding. You have taken this jealous little stunt way too far, my father bellowed, marching aggressively toward me, pointing a thick, shaking finger directly in my face. You are going to fix this right now, Claire. You are going to call off these ridiculous federal lawyers, and you are going to give Mason the vice president position he absolutely deserves. We are a family. You do not do this to family. You owe us your absolute loyalty. As my father lunged a step forward in a blind rage, my lead counsel Marcus smoothly stepped directly into his path. The towering corporate lawyer did not raise his voice, but his imposing physical presence and the heavy, expensive cut of his bespoke suit forced my father to abruptly halt. "You need to take several steps back immediately, sir," Marcus stated, in a low, incredibly dangerous tone that promised severe legal consequences if Thomas dared to close the distance. "This is an active, high-level, corporate dispute, and you are entirely out of your depth." My father stood frozen, his fists clenched in complete, impotent rage. He was completely unable to bypass the absolute wall of corporate power I had erected around myself. I did not back away from his threatening posture. I simply tilted my head, looking at the two people who had spent my entire life actively trying to erase my existence. "Where was this fierce family loyalty yesterday morning?" I asked my voice, cutting cleanly and ruthlessly through their hysterical screaming. "Where was this profound bond of blood when you fully endorsed Mason forcing me into the service hallway? Where was this protective maternal instinct when you both laughed wildly as he publicly humiliated me during the bridal shower? You do not care about family loyalty, Thomas. You only care that your personal financial ATM just got permanently unplugged. You funded his entire lavish lifestyle because he promised you a massive return on your investment." I continued stepping closer to my father, forcing him to take a hesitant step backward on the stage. "He told you his new executive salary would easily pay off the massive second mortgage you secretly took out on your house to fund this pathetic charade. But Mason aggressively lied to you. He has absolutely nothing. He is deeply in debt, he is facing a severe federal indictment, and he is going to spend the next decade drowning in devastating legal fees. Your golden boy is completely bankrupt, and he is taking your entire retirement fund down with him." My father's face went entirely pale. The aggressive fire in his eyes instantly extinguished, replaced by a hollow, overwhelming terror. My mother violently gasped, clutching her chest as she turned to look down at her weeping son. Mason could not even meet her eyes. He just kept his face buried deeply in his hands, his shoulders heaving with pathetic, desperate sobs. Before my parents could utter another desperate word, a new sound cut through the heavy chaos. It was the sharp, aggressive rustle of a massive bridal gown moving with terrifying speed. Kendra was marching toward the stage, her face twisted into a highly toxic mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Her wealthy aunts and elite society friends watched in horrified fascination as the beautiful, perfectly composed bride completely disintegrated into a vengeful force of nature. Kendra aggressively shoved my mother entirely out of the way. She stood directly over Mason, her chest heaving heavily, her perfectly manicured hands balled into tight, shaking fists. "Look at me," Kendra commanded, her voice an ear-splitting shriek that made the microphone on the table screech with harsh digital feedback. "Look at me right now, Mason." Mason slowly lowered his hands, his face heavily stained with tears and cold sweat. He looked up at his new wife with the wide, terrified eyes of a trapped animal. "Kendra, please," he whimpered, reaching a trembling hand out toward the heavy layers of her silk skirt. "I can fix this. I swear, I can fix this entire situation. We just need to talk to her in private."
Kendra violently slapped his hand away. The sharp, brutal crack of skin on skin echoed incredibly loudly through the entire reception hall. "You promised me a multi-million-dollar future," Kendra screamed, her voice echoing with raw, devastating betrayal. "You looked me directly in the eyes and promised me you were becoming a senior vice president on Monday morning. You aggressively swore that the $200,000 personal loan we took out for this wedding was just a temporary financial bridge until your massive executive signing bonus officially cleared." Kendra turned wildly to the massive crowd, gesturing aggressively toward her elite, wealthy family members seated in the very front rows. "I just signed a legally binding marriage certificate with a completely broke, unemployed fraud." She yelled, the horrifying reality of her total financial ruin pushing her over the edge into total, violent hysteria. "I just legally tied myself to a man who was actively being sued by a billionaire private equity firm. My father invited 3 separate state senators to this reception. The chief executive officer of my mother's massive real estate firm is sitting at table 4. You have permanently destroyed my social standing. You have made my entire family look like absolute fools for associating with a common street criminal. You do not even have basic health insurance anymore. You do not have a severance package. You stole intellectual property and you dragged my powerful family name directly into a massive federal investigation." "Kendra, baby, please do not do this in front of everyone," Mason begged pathetically, dropping heavily to his knees on the wooden stage, perfectly ruining his expensive, rented tuxedo pants. "Please, I did all of this entirely for you. I wanted to give you the perfect, wealthy life you truly deserve." "You did this because you are an arrogant, entirely incompetent liar," Kendra roared, leaning down so her face was inches from his. "You are entirely useless. You actively used my elite family connections to blindly elevate your own pathetic status. And now you have publicly humiliated me in front of every single important person I know. You are not a wealthy tech visionary. You are just a massive, disgusting fraud." With a sudden, violently aggressive motion, Kendra reached up and firmly grabbed the expensive heavy lace veil pinned tightly into her elaborate hairstyle. She aggressively ripped it entirely off her head, taking a large chunk of her perfectly styled hair with it. She forcefully threw the crumpled white lace directly into Mason's weeping face. "I am filing for a complete legal annulment the absolute second the county courthouse opens on Monday morning," Kendra declared coldly, her voice finally dropping to a lethal, deadly whisper that chilled the entire room. "Do not ever speak to me again. Do not ever contact my family. You make me physically sick to my stomach." Kendra turned sharply on her expensive high heels. She completely ignored my terrified parents. She completely ignored the massive, utterly silent crowd of deeply shocked guests. She aggressively grabbed the heavy layers of her $200,000 silk wedding dress, marched quickly down the wooden stairs, and walked straight out of the elite country club. The heavy oak doors slammed firmly shut behind her, forever sealing Mason's total, completely unavoidable destruction. The heavy oak doors slammed firmly shut behind her, forever sealing Mason's total, completely unavoidable destruction. The sharp, violent sound echoed like a final gavel strike in a heavily fortified courtroom. My parents were still frantic, their voices overlapping in a pathetic, desperate screaming match as they desperately tried to comfort a golden son who was completely beyond saving. I did not stay to watch them mourn the sudden death of their false empire. I simply turned my back on the hysterical chaos unfolding on the brilliantly lit stage. I walked calmly and deliberately across the pristine white marble floor, my expensive heels clicking rhythmically, completely ignoring the horrified, paralyzed stares of the remaining elite guests. I stopped directly in front of the heavily decorated head table, where my parents had been sitting just moments before. I reached carefully into my black designer clutch and pulled out a small, neatly folded piece of white thermal paper. It was the heavily itemized receipt
from the lavish rehearsal dinner they had proudly hosted the night before. I placed the $6,500 invoice face up on the expensive silk tablecloth right next to my mother's abandoned crystal champagne flute. Thomas and Catherine abruptly stopped their frantic screaming and stared blankly down at the small piece of paper. "This is the absolute final financial contribution you will ever receive from me," I stated clearly, my voice freezing the very air around them. "I am permanently cutting off the anonymous corporate credit lines I have been secretly paying to keep your massive suburban mortgage afloat for the past 4 years. The fake private consulting fees I quietly routed through Apex Holdings to directly fund your lavish country club memberships are officially terminated. You built your entire comfortable life on my silent financial labor, while aggressively tearing me down to constantly elevate a complete fraud. Now the bank is going to call in those massive debts, and you are entirely on your own." I did not wait for their shocked, horrified responses. I walked straight out of the grand doors of the country club, leaving the toxic, burning wreckage of my former family brightly illuminating the rearview mirror. 3 brutal weeks later, the ruthless reality of the corporate legal system had completely decimated what was left of the Williams family. The severe federal investigation moved with terrifying, unprecedented speed. Mason was legally forced by a federal judge to liquidate every single physical asset he owned just to pay his rapidly mounting defense attorney retainers. He was officially evicted from his luxury downtown apartment by armed sheriffs after missing a single massive rent payment. True to her furious public promise, Kendra filed for a highly publicized legal annulment on the Monday morning immediately following the disastrous wedding reception, completely severing all legal ties and deliberately leaving Mason drowning in massive vendor debt from the shattered event. The entire global technology industry permanently blacklisted him. His name became a massive, highly toxic liability that no corporate entity would ever dare touch. He was a complete ghost in the financial sector. The collateral damage also rapidly swallowed my parents. Without my secret monthly cash injections, their heavily mortgaged estate immediately went into aggressive foreclosure. The house was seized by the bank, leaving them with absolutely nowhere to live, forced into the streets to rely on the charity of distant relatives who now actively despised them. I was standing in the massive sunlit atrium of the Apex Holdings global headquarters in downtown Manhattan, finalizing a highly lucrative overseas acquisition with my senior executive board. The towering glass and steel skyscraper was a massive monument to absolute financial dominance, buzzing with powerful executives and high-level security personnel. I was just about to step into my private biometric glass elevator when a chaotic, desperate commotion violently erupted near the main security checkpoint. I turned slowly, my slate-gray eyes narrowing at the sudden disturbance. There, violently struggling against 3 heavily armed, massive corporate security guards, was my former family. Mason looked completely unrecognizable. The arrogant, perfectly groomed tech manager was entirely gone, replaced by a highly erratic, severely unkempt man, wearing deeply wrinkled, unwashed clothes and weeks of jagged facial hair. Catherine and Thomas violently flanked him, looking aged, exhausted, and thoroughly broken, their expensive country club attire permanently replaced by cheap, heavily worn layers. "Claire, please!" Mason screamed hysterically, his voice cracking wildly as a large security guard firmly restrained his arms behind his back. He forcefully dropped to his knees on the cold, polished granite floor of my corporate lobby, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his human dignity in front of hundreds of my employees. "You have to help me. I am begging you, on my hands and knees." The ruthless federal prosecutors are aggressively threatening me with 10 years in a minimum security prison for corporate espionage. I am completely bankrupt. The banks repossessed my car yesterday. They are physically foreclosing on Mom and Dad's house next week because they cannot make the massive balloon payments without my fake executive salary. My mother violently fell to her knees right next to him, heavy, desperate tears aggressively streaking down her pale, wrinkled face. Please, Claire Catherine sobbed loudly, clasping her shaking hands together in a desperate, frantic prayer. We are so incredibly sorry. We were so completely wrong about you. Just give him a job. He will do absolutely anything you ask. He will scrub the toilets in this massive building. He will empty your executive trash cans every single night. Just give him a minimum wage janitorial job so the federal judge can see he is actively trying to pay off his massive legal restitution debts. Please, I am begging you as your mother, do not let your only brother go to federal prison. The entire lobby of wealthy executives and powerful corporate lawyers stopped entirely watching the highly pathetic display of absolute financial ruin playing out on the pristine granite floor. I looked down at the three people who had spent 33 years actively trying to destroy my spirit and steal my hard-earned success. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering, toxic family loyalty. I felt absolutely nothing but cold, highly clinical satisfaction. I am deeply sorry, I stated calmly, my voice projecting clearly and effortlessly across the massive, completely silent atrium. Apex Holdings maintains a very strict, uncompromising corporate hiring policy. We absolutely do not employ convicted felons. I turned my back on their agonizing, hysterical screams, stepped directly into my private glass elevator, and firmly pressed the button for the absolute top floor. The heavy glass doors of my private elevator began to glide smoothly together, threatening to finally separate me from their agonizing wails, but as I watched my mother violently pound her fists against the pristine granite floor of the massive lobby, a final, unresolved memory flared fiercely in my mind. The corporate vengeance was entirely complete, but the personal ledger still contained one massive unpaid debt. I abruptly thrust my hand forward, breaking the optical safety sensor. The doors instantly retracted with a sharp, mechanical hiss. I stepped back out into the massive atrium. Two elite, heavily armed security directors immediately stepped out from the shadows flanking me on both sides, like silent, lethal sentinels. The sudden, terrifying shift in my demeanor caused my parents to instantly freeze. Mason stopped his pathetic whimpering, looking up at me with a sudden, desperate spark of completely unwarranted hope. "You came back," my mother whispered, her voice trembling wildly as she desperately tried to stand up on her shaking legs. "You are going to help us." I did not break my stride. I walked directly over to the head of corporate security and retrieved a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope from his massive hands. I walked back and aggressively threw the heavy package directly onto the floor at my father's feet. The sharp slap of the thick paper echoed loudly in the completely silent room. "I am not here to offer salvation," I stated, my voice echoing like shattering ice in the massive hall. "I am here to close the absolute final account. Open the envelope, Thomas." My father's hands violently shook as he reached down, frantically tearing the heavy paper open. A thick stack of highly official, legally binding documents spilled out onto the polished marble floor. The top pages were entirely covered in stark, aggressive red legal stamps. "Those are permanent, court-ordered restraining orders," I announced coldly, making sure my voice carried to the hundreds of powerful executives watching the spectacle. "They heavily restrict all three of you from ever coming within 500 feet of me, my residential properties, my global corporate offices, or any of my registered charitable foundations. If you ever attempt to call my private phone, send me a single email, or physically approach this building again, my elite legal team will have you instantly arrested for severe criminal harassment." My mother violently gasped, clutching her chest and covering her mouth in sheer terror. "But you are our daughter," she sobbed loudly, tears aggressively streaming down her face. "We raised you. We sacrificed everything for you." "You did not sacrifice a single thing for me, Catherine.
I snarled, completely dropping the polite corporate facade and letting my raw, unfiltered fury completely dominate the massive room. I aggressively pointed my finger at a specific stack of heavily highlighted banking records buried deep within the scattered documents. Look at those specific transaction histories. Look at the exact date. 14 years ago, I worked 3 exhausting jobs during high school to secretly fund my own college tuition because you completely refused to help me. I aggressively saved $40,000. And exactly 2 weeks before my freshman semester began, you and Thomas illegally forged my signature, entirely drained my private savings account, and used my hard-earned money to buy Mason his very first luxury sports car. The entire corporate lobby gasped in absolute horror. Dozens of wealthy executives and powerful corporate lawyers stared at my parents with absolute, unadulterated disgust. My father's face drained of all remaining color. He violently choked on his own breath, completely unable to deny the heavily documented financial theft. You aggressively robbed your own teenage daughter to buy a useless status symbol for a son who just destroyed your entire lives, I stated, my voice dripping with lethal, uncompromising venom. You legally committed severe financial fraud. I could easily have the ruthless federal prosecutors add those ancient bank records to Mason's current criminal indictment. But I am not going to do that. I want you to spend the rest of your miserable lives living on the streets, knowing that you actively engineered your own total destruction. You fiercely traded a daughter who could have easily bought you the world for a completely fraudulent son who just handed you a massive eviction notice. I turned sharply to my massive security directors. "Throw these trespassers out of my building immediately," I commanded coldly. "And if they violently resist, call the local police and have them thrown into a concrete holding cell." I turned my back on them for the absolute final time. I walked directly into my private elevator and firmly pressed the glowing button for the penthouse suite. The glass doors slid completely shut, instantly silencing the frantic, hysterical screaming of the 3 completely broken strangers being aggressively dragged out into the unforgiving city streets by armed guards. The high-speed elevator shot upward, leaving the toxic, burning wreckage of my past far below. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into my massive, sunlit penthouse office. The entire space was surrounded by towering, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the sprawling Manhattan skyline. I walked slowly over to my heavy mahogany desk, pouring myself a small crystal glass of incredibly expensive bourbon. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the absolute, profound silence of my hard-earned empire wash over me. I was finally completely free. The heavy, suffocating chain they had violently wrapped around my neck for 33 years was permanently shattered.